Okay, so we're Teammate, and we are going to be updating you on our project within Getty Vineyard. Our agenda today is that we're going to be going through the problem review, basically just reviewing the problem that was given to us by our clients. We're going to describe the solution and how we came to that. We're going to discuss the implementation process of our solution, and then we're going to talk about some risks and their corresponding mitigations surrounding them. So up front, just again for a recap, our team has been working within Getty Vineyards out of Cameron, Texas. Our client approached us with a common problem in the food processing industry. Basically, the waste product left over at the end of the winemaking process is called pomace. It includes smashed grape skins, pulps, seeds, and stems. And our client essentially asked if there was anything that he could do with this material to increase his revenue. As we discussed in the past, there are plenty of solutions that are currently being used in this industry, but our client gave us two significant constraints, which were low cost and easy implementation. And Getty Vineyards already has an established winemaking business, and so our solution needs to complement that. The three potential solutions that we discussed were producing a homemade compost using the pomace, extracting a grapeseed oil out of the pomace, and making a drink called second wine. Grapeseed oil is a natural skincare product, and second wine is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically just a diluted wine product. And while both of these are valid solutions and are used by wineries across the world, they did not fit our constraints, which were, again, low cost and easy implementation. On the other hand, grape pomace can be used mixed with chicken litter to make a compost that can be used on site or even sold in excess to local farms. This is a low-cost solution that ends up saving money for our client in the long run, and it's easily implemented, only costing about an extra $600 upfront. And based on our calculations, Getty Vineyards stands to save about $252 in annual savings, and their overhead costs will be paid back in about 2.5 years.
So for the implementation of this solution, it goes along with, fortunately, it goes along with the growing season for this vineyard, and it can, as the customer requested, it can be easily implemented into this system without added busy work or any additional training, really. So the first thing that they will need to be able to do when they're ready to start is the compost setup and maintenance. The compost is going to be ready to come together after the first winemaking season. And once they have that pomace, they can go ahead and get started and get the chicken litter delivered to the site and get it mixed up. Throughout the setup of the compost, it needs to be maintained at a moisture content of about 40 to 60%, and then also turned once or twice a week to give proper air exposure throughout the piles. The full process timeline I'll show in a Gantt chart below, or in the next slide, but it generally is going to range between harvest to early spring, which is about give or take 8 months. And the compost needs to be spread when the grapes start to show bulbs. So that's generally that's going to be early spring. The operational requirements for implementation, the vineyard is going to need to be able to set aside space that is out of the way of any potential guests or employees, for the main reason being that the compost, especially with higher moisture content, can start to have foul smells and would be blown into the guests, walkway and area in the vineyard, and that wouldn't be a great look for this business. So they will definitely need to be able to set aside some space for approximately 8 tons of compost, and that would be mixed together with the pomace and the chicken litter. And then as far as labor, they're going to need about 1 to 2 hours per week for the compost maintenance, and then whenever they're ready to spread it, as they would with fertilizer schedule, the compost schedule is going to be about the same time, early spring, and they're going to need the tractor and spreading equipment to do that. So as you can see, here's the Gantt chart for implementation along with the first cycle of this process. So harvest is generally going to be early to midsummer. So just for this projection, we're saying that August 1st, as like midsummer. the harvest would come, and then they are going to be able to crush the grapes and go through fermentation just as they would with a normal winemaking process. And then after fermentation is when the pomace is going to be ready to start mixing with or as a compost. And so we're thinking about September 1st, setting up chicken litter delivery and go ahead and mixing it in the proper location. And then the main critical time is going to be that time so that they can get the compost set up and maintain it to be ready for the next growing season, specifically whenever the grapes start to show bulbs in early spring. And so that's when the compost will need to be ready. So they have a significant amount of time from September up until about March to maintain and to keep that compost at the right level for supplementation of the grapes. And then once we get to early April, then they will be able to load it in the spreader and spread it throughout the vineyard across the 3 acres, and they're about 2 to 3 tons per acre at that spread. And then that process would be done until the next harvest, and it could be to begin the cycle again.
All right. So when looking at this solution, our biggest risk would be improper technique, and this improper technique would be incorrect moisture levels and thus the moisture content of the compost, and incorrectly aerating the mix. It's really important that we hit this mark of 40 to 60% moisture content of the compost pile with the chicken litter, to increase microbial breakdown and give us that nutritional value that we're looking for of the NPK ratios. Um, Along with that, we need to make sure that we aerate the pile just to also aid in that breakdown and make sure that it actually breaks down. If the pile is too dry, it's just not going to have that microbial growth to aid in it. And if it's too wet, then the pile pretty much goes sour, meaning the whole process is ruined. So to mitigate that, we're going to have training on a couple testing methods that I'm about to go into, just to make sure that we're getting that right gauge of moisture content and aeration. To go along with that, we'll have a scheduling system just to keep employees or our client on track to make sure that they are checking the pile, turning the pile, and that way it's ready for spreading. So for these testing methods on moisture content, the first method we're going to go.
Wayne, you went back to mute. Unmute yourself. There you
Okay,
go.
what was the last thing that I said? I'm so sorry. I think
You just give it about 10 seconds. You're good. Start with this slide.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just go back and say we'll go into training methods right now to gauge the moisture content value. I'm not sure if it was covered, but I'll go back and say the first method.
You muted yourself when you changed the slide, so just start with the next slide.
Moisture content methods.
There you go. Start there.
Oh, I think we're on the slide back. I didn't really get into the training parts for testing the moisture content. Okay. So for testing the moisture content, we'll go with the sponge method first. And this is just where a client or employee would put a glove on their hand and kind of reach into the pile about 16 to 24 inches in, and then squeeze the compost mix and see if it reacts like a sponge and kind of compresses slowly and uncompresses slowly. And this would kind of give us that gauge of 40 to 60% moisture content. The second method would just be simply a visual and smell test to check the pile. Like James said, if the pile is smelling like ammonia, it's too wet and it would need to be turned or dried out. And then if it looks dry, then you just add water. But both of those previous methods can kind of leave a little guesswork in there. So we're going to suggest that our client just gets a moisture meter. And with that, he would just probe into the middle of the pile and get the measurement and ensure that he's in that 40-60% ratio so that the pile processes correctly for use. Okay. Our second risk would be that the pile has an incorrect nutritional value. And this would just mean like his nitrogen, phosphate, and potash ratios. To mitigate this, we would just once again get the finished result compost tested again with the lab and make sure it's in that spot, and also to create a manual to ensure that he is getting the correct ratio of mixing, about that 7 to 30 mix for the correct values that he needs for his grapes. And if he also wanted to add like more potash or more nitrogen, we can create a list of other additives such as wood chips he could add into the pile of, say, he needs more nitrogen one season than the other.
Yeah, so continuing with our risks, another one we determined was the possibility of hazardous materials. So since our compost is composed of pumice and chicken litter, there is a concern of pathogen contamination like bacteria and fungi and parasitic protozoa. And this can affect the employees that come in contact with it. It could possibly cause illness or the possibility of catching disease caused by bacteria and pathogens. This is also very harmful. This also could be harmful to animals that are on property or around in the soil itself that they're growing these grapes, in the waterways that might be nearby. So the compost material can also be a danger if improperly stored or mixed incorrectly. If it is stored or accidentally mixed near other chemicals, this could make the mixture of the compost flammable and pose a concern to the vineyard. So the way we plan to mitigate this risk is providing a proper storage plan for our client. This would include a location and a container type for the client. So basically, we're suggesting a sealed type of container for our client and a location that is away from the vineyard so that the risk of harmful like bacteria and pathogens to the animals and water and also possible flammability be decreased due to possible flammability. We are also going to suggest training on proper handling of a fire, as well as including fire extinguishers around the container location, so that flammability is not an issue. There's also the initial wait time for the compost. Like it was shown in our Gantt chart, the actual mixture of compost takes a while. So the compost would have to be mixed outside for about 3 weeks in order for initial decomposition and bacteria release so that it can then be properly stored in those containers. As mentioned, the employees are at risk for illness and catching a disease because of bacteria and pathogens. So proper hygienic practices, such as like hand washing or wearing gloves, would be a way to mitigate that risk as well. Next slide, please. So our next step is to meet with our faculty advisor on April 15th to get some more suggestions on how to implement and decrease the risk that we were mentioning today, as well as doing our Zoom practice session, writing our final report, and prepping for our final presentation and poster for the end of the semester. And now, if y'all have any questions.
Okay, let's have Team 5 with a couple of questions or comments, please.
Yeah, I got a question. when you talk about the chicken litter, are you talking about like wood shavings or what?
No, it's actually litter that comes from like chicken houses in Milam County. They there's a pretty much all of them hire out drivers, or they have like third party drivers that load up the chicken litter and sell it to farmers around the area. And some of them actually even have that litter composting on site for, at the chicken litter places in their own containers. So they're just ready to load up, and it's actually got like dead chickens and stuff like that into also composting together.
All right, cool. Thank you.
I had a question as well. I don't know if it was said when you accidentally muted yourself or something, but I was wondering if like you talked about the smell, since it is going to be on site with like the vineyard and such, and if it like what happens if the smell does get too bad? Like how do y'all like go about that? Like just to prevent customers from obviously not having a good experience at the vineyard.
So pretty much we're just not gonna try and let the mixture get to that point where it is smelling. And it would be kind of really hard to do that because you could visually see that the mix is too wet. And like I said, we would be testing to make sure the moisture content is within those limits to where it's not over 60%, which would produce that smell. Along with that, I don't know if I muted or did not. We would have that moisture gauge, which would then make sure that we're also in that bracket.
Okay, I didn't know if it was an extreme or not, or if it was like
No,
a common occurrence. Gotcha.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that common.
Sweet, thanks.
Okay, I think that's good. All right, so we don't have a client, right? A client present?
No, sir.
No, no client.
Good presentation, well organized, well distributed. I had really only, you have addressed all the risks and you have some proposed ways to mitigate the risk. I like that you are advising the client to purchase some monitoring devices, not just a sponge method, so they can actually do more continuous testing on the moisture content. You keep talking about they need to store 8 tons of compost in the proper location and how. So I still have questions. What are you proposing that they do? You keep saying they need to find the right space and location to store that. What is the proper storage condition for that? Does it have to be it's huge, it's 8 tons. So I still think that you didn't address that very well. Maybe you know the information, but you didn't show that to me. So anyone knows the answer? What is the proper compost storage condition to avoid the smell and decomposing and all that stuff? Do you know the answer to that?
For the mix to get aeration and all that, it would require to be outside and for watering and all that. So it would have to be maybe not in a sense stored, but it would have to be out in like the past area so that the process can take place. Of course, away from like the main showroom of the winery and the store. For the storage part, I don't know if it was very specifically clear, but it needs to be stored in its own facility, so like in containers rather than it's not just like sitting there in like stored in its own area, away from the wines or grapes in that sense. But at that point, it would be a finished product, so then it would just be in containers for storage rather than just being in that creation process.
And I would say also that you could basically we don't want it right next to the grapes and right next to where everybody's walking and things like that. So if there's a building that they could potentially put it on the other side of, or even if the customer wanted to pour like a concrete barrier or wall just to contain it, so that the wind isn't blowing over to Nate, if we do get that smell or even potentially lose some of our compost, like due to the wind, that way you could kind of mitigate some of that loss and also the poor experience of harmful smells.
Okay, yeah, good answer, you, James and Blake. I just want you to know that you have an idea, you have some recommendation, just explain that, communicate that to the client, because he might be interested in that. Okay, 8 tons of compost, what do I do with that? And you do have some suggestions, so that's good job. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Castell. Yes, I agree. It's a good presentation. It's exactly 15 minutes long, almost perfectly distributed among the 4 of you. You hit the major points of the implementation plan and the risk, and you were able to mitigate the risks very well with a lot of detail that would have made me confident as a client that the compost pile, although it may pose a risk, they're easily managed. James, go to your implementation plan real quick. I'm gonna look at your 4 steps. Yeah, here we go. No, go back up one, yeah. So compost setup and maintenance. I wasn't sure really what that means. What is the compost setup? You're talking about actually building the compost pile with the appropriate mixture, right?
Yes, sir. Just the mixture, which would take just delivery of the chicken litter and having the pomace ready.
Okay, and what do you mean by maintenance?
Maintenance would just be checking for the moisture content and turning. So that's done throughout. That's like where you start it, and it's done throughout. There's no really other process to set it up. You just need to look at those 2 factors.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to quibble over a word a little bit here. Maybe the word you need is management there instead of maintenance, but that's not a big deal. You used a phrase a couple of times, and it's here as well. It says compost needs to be spread when grapes start to show bulbs. You mean that when the vines start to show the bulbs? What is that?
Yes, sir. Sorry, the grape plants, the vines. Once they're starting to show their fruit, I guess bulbing, and that's when the farmer should know, or the operator should know, that fertilizer and or compost needs to be spread.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm quibbling over proper terminology here. And let's talk about tractor and spreading equipment. Do they already have a tractor and a compost spreader, manure spreader, or anything like that?
Yes, sir. They do have that equipment.
So have they been spreading compost? They've been spreading fertilizer already, right?
Fertilizer, yes, sir.
So they're just going to be able to use the same equipment?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. All right, good. Morgan, your delivery was very smooth. I thought your introduction was good. Let's go down to Blaine. Blaine, I felt like your presentation needed some more energy. You're not talking in a presentation style where you enunciate some words and try to really get your point across. I felt like you were just kind of talking like you might to your roommate. Okay, so add some more energy, and I want you to be aware of the fact that when you're presenting, it's not the same as just talking to somebody. It's a presentation tone, okay? So we're going to email out the link to this presentation. You guys will all be able to watch it. I want you to review. Blaine, I want you to review your presentation and see if you can see what I'm talking about. Let's go to your slides, your risk slides. Very well articulated here. The only thing I would probably add is, and I think Dr. Castell may have mentioned this, if you're going to recommend some equipment, it'd be good to show that equipment and go into a little more detail on what the testing is. So you covered that pretty well, but I feel like it needed a little bit more text representation there. So you definitely got credit for that. So that was good. So I feel like you need a little bit more information and even maybe some pictures on these slides, because as a client, I'm thinking, well, what is a test kit? What does that look like? Where do I get it? What does it cost? Was that built into the economic analysis? That kind of stuff. Let's go to Annalise hazmat. Yeah, there we go. Hazardous materials, hazmat. I thought this was good. I mean, it's a compost pile. It's not something we've had before. What are some possible risks I don't know that the bacteria and the pathogens that are present in a compost pile are actually harmful to humans. That would be something I would ask as a client. So let me play the part of the client. Annalie, are the bacteria and pathogens that are present in a compost pile, does that make people sick? Is there any literature or data that supports that idea?
So what we had found is it is possible I know you mentioned in our last presentation the term of fertilizer. And so basically like fertilizer can cause bacteria and pathogens. Of course, this is more of a organic compost versus a fertilizer. But we did find that, like we mentioned, moisture content and the if you're like leaving it sit out for too long, the moisture content can cause bacteria to grow that we do not want. So if a employee is handling it and not wearing like proper PPE, then it can cause possible illness if like, they're not washing their hands, wearing gloves, and, touching and eating things after working with it.
Okay. All right. Good answer. I probably still want to see a little bit more data on that. The last thing I'm going to say is, so here again, you've got some good mitigation, proper storage location and container. And I'm going to emphasize what Dr. Castell said. This is a good opportunity for you to recommend a site on the location there, so the client doesn't have to go, well, what does that mean? So you guys do some analysis and say, see this building here? It'd be good to put it behind this building because the customers never go there, and it's upwind, or I'm sorry, it's downwind, so there won't be any odors going over to where the customers might be. So, and secondly, what is a proper container? There are lots of different containers. There are barrels that people can put compost in and rotate them, but you're talking about 8 tons. So if I was the client, I'd be going, well, what kind of container do you recommend? So you need to have that in there.